Jesus said, Father, forgive them. They do not know what they do. Now, Jesus said, I could pray and God would send me 12 legions of angels, which would be about 72,000 angels. But he didn't pray for deliverance. He prayed for forgiveness for the people that were doing him wrong. In his resurrection, he said to his disciples, if you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain their sins, they're retained. And of course, post-resurrection, you have Stephen, who's the first martyr of the church. And as he's being stoned to death, right, he knelt down and he cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not charge them with this sin. And when he had said this, he fell asleep. Again, I think it's so interesting that Jesus said after the resurrection, if you forgive the sins of any, they're forgiven. And if you retain the sins of any, they're retained. Pastor Bernie was in Southern Asia, probably now about 15 or 16 months ago. And there was an imam who asked to see Pastor Bernie. He had questions. And the reason he had questions, he had tortured to death, literally to death, a pastor. And that pastor kept saying to him, you can't make me hate you. I love you and I forgive you. And it just haunted him. That man said, you can't make me hate you. I love you, I forgive you. And so he asked Pastor Bernie to speak with him. And literally, Bernie didn't have to do it. I mean, Bernie talked to him, shared the gospel, but he got saved. And I really believe the reason that he got saved was because that man did not hold his sins against him. He forgave, just like Stephen forgave. Right? Jesus said to love your enemies. Now, in Hebrews 12 and verse 15, in the Translator's New Testament, it says it this way. It says, see to it that no one falls away from God's grace, that no bitterness spring up to cause trouble and spoil everybody's life, right? The King James talks about the root of bitterness, right? How many of you know when you have a certain type of root, that root grows, and underground, there's more than what there is above the ground, right? But the root is going to produce the fruit of the root. And when we've got bitterness, it's a root. And notice it says it causes trouble, and it spoils whose life? Everybody's life. People are bitter against somebody, and they really want them to pay. They want revenge. They want justice. And they hold that against that person. But what happens is this, the person that's affected is not the other person, it's you, right? And when it says it spoils everybody's life, it spoils your life, right? Your entire outlook on life is affected by the unforgiveness that you have. And it affects how you treat your spouse, how you treat your kids, your coworkers. It affects every area of your life. Psalms 119, verse 165 says, great peace have they that love thy law, and nothing shall offend them. What is going to offend you? Nothing. And one of the signs of spiritual maturity, right, is that you forgive. That people do you wrong, and it just goes off you like water off a duck's back. When Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss, what did Jesus say? Friend. Friend. He did not hold that against him. I think it's interesting that when Jesus is teaching on the subject of forgiveness, the disciples said to Jesus, Lord, increase our faith. Right? Because most people think that forgiveness is a feeling. It's not a feeling. Forgiveness itself is a decision. It is a decision to no longer demand any recompense of that person and to turn that person literally over to God and say, God, you take care of this. I forgive them. And then, of course, Jesus told us that we need to do something because faith without works is dead, right? So you forgive by faith. You make that decision, but then you pray for that person. Jesus said, you've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. In other words, Jesus is saying you forgive as a decision, but then you put works with your faith and you pray for that person. Right? Now, you don't pray they have a car wreck. Right? You pray that God bless them. You pray God give them revelation. You pray what you would want in your life for that person's life. And when you do, God turns your heart. And the Apostle Paul said it this way, that God enlarges your heart. Right? He gives you compassion for that person. And I said this last week, but this bears repeating. Right? Your heart turns towards the one you pray to. Your heart turns to the one you pray with. And your heart turns to the one you pray for. And if you will pray for somebody, over time, God will turn your heart towards that person. So Jesus taught us about forgiveness. Now, the Pharisees come to Jesus, and this is in Matthew 19. The third verse, it says this, the Pharisees also came to him, testing him, and saying to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? Right? Now, there were two different schools of thought. And one literally, if your wife burnt the toast, you just said, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, and you could divorce her for just any reason. And the other was much, much stricter. Then he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them in the beginning made them male and female? And for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Once again, when Jesus is asked questions, Jesus always goes back to the beginning. Right? In Bible interpretation, there's what's referred to as the principle or the law of first mention. The first time anything is mentioned in the Bible, God lays down all the predominant truths about that thing. So when the Pharisees come to Jesus with questions, he's always going back. Go back to the beginning. And he said, he that made them made the two one. They become one flesh. So then they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. And they said to him, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and put her away? Now listen to Jesus' answer. He said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. All right. So number one, divorce is that was never part of God's plan. Right? But number two, Jesus said, whenever there's a divorce, listen, it's because of hardness of heart. That's the cause. Read it again. Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. Ephesians 4, verse 32. Be kind to one another, tenderhearted. Now, the opposite of a hard heart is a tender heart. All right? Be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. Right? So what does a tender heart do? A tender heart forgives. So what Jesus said is this, that when there's a divorce, there's a hard heart. There's at least one hard heart. I want to just say, it is impossible. Right? I know, but when you're engaged, you just think this person is perfect. We will never have any problems. We will never have any disagreements. They will never do anything wrong. Ha ha. Right? It is impossible to live with somebody 24/7, 365, and not have them say or do something stupid. It is impossible. All right? And you know what? You can forgive. And if you can forgive, listen, and Jesus said you can forgive, you can fall in love with the same person 1,000 times. And you'll have a great marriage. But if you don't forgive and you have a hard heart, all right? Jesus said, that's why Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, because you were hard-hearted. You weren't kind and you didn't forgive, right? And when you don't forgive, there's just two options. One, you have a stinking marriage. Two, you end up in a divorce court, right? Now, it may be, the Bible says it this way in Romans. It says, as much as it depends on you, live peaceably with all men, all right? And it's not just saying with males, it's just saying with people. As much as it depends on you. How many of you know that sometimes there are some people who just will not stop being an idiot? I think you caught it, all right? Now, as much as it depends on you, you keep forgiving. But how many of you realize if somebody won't cooperate, things can get real, a relationship can get very strained, right? But as much as it depends on you, be kind and forgive one another, right? It's true in marriage, and it's also true in relationships in general, right? When we forgive, we can continue in a relationship, right? So Jesus said this in Mark chapter 11, verse 25. Now, it's interesting. This is where Jesus teaches on faith. There is no place in the Bible where there is more teaching on the subject of faith than right here. And Jesus puts forgiveness right in the middle. He says, whenever or every time you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, forgive him. That your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses. It's every time you pray. It doesn't matter what, he said, anything. Doesn't matter what the other person did. He said, anyone, doesn't matter how close they were to you. He said, you forgive. Now, Jesus said to do this every time you pray. The reason he said that is because when we don't forgive, it becomes a root. And it goes down inside and begins to affect us. But it says that eventually it will spring up and spoil your life. Eventually. So Jesus said, every time, just check your heart. I think that what Jesus is saying is this. It's impossible. In fact, Jesus said this. It's impossible that no offenses come. It is impossible for you to live your life and not have offenses, not have people do the wrong thing. So Jesus said this, that you can forgive anybody of anything in 5 minutes. I've literally had people come up and tell me what somebody did. And I said, well, when did that happen? And they said, over 20 years ago. And I just can't forgive them. Well, Jesus said you can forgive. Jesus said, while you pray, you can forgive. Because forgiveness is a decision. It's not a feeling. And once you make the decision, you follow through by praying for that person. Right? And somebody said, how long should I pray for them? Every time you pray until there's no more feelings that are bad. You just keep praying and keep praying. And what does that do? That affects your heart. That keeps your heart tender. Tender towards God and tender towards other people. If there's anybody who, if we look at in our Bible, who could have had a reason to have resentment towards somebody, I think it would be Joseph. First of all, his brothers beat him up, throw him in a pit, right? Then they sell him as a slave. He's working as a slave. How many of you know that your brother shouldn't treat you like that? Then he's working as a slave, and his master's wife tries to seduce him. And when he runs away, she accuses him of rape and has him thrown in prison. In prison, he helps some people who totally forget about him. Right? But this is what he said in Genesis 41. It says God literally promotes him. And Joseph, and he's married at this point, and he says, Joseph called the name of his firstborn son Manasseh, for God has caused me to forget all of my toil in all my father's house. He said, I have forgiven, and I no longer look back at what happened in my past and go, oh, how terrible that was, all right? So he forgives, and then he can look back and there's no pain from what has happened in his past. That only happens when you forgive, right? Then secondly, he has another son named Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Do you know you will never have a truly fruitful life until you forgive what has happened in your past? It's when you forgive what's happened in your past that the fruitfulness, the purpose of your life really begins to flourish. I think it's interesting that as Jesus is giving the greatest sermon that was ever preached, it's in Matthew chapter 7. It's the entire Sermon on the Mount. He says, and why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye and not consider the plank or the log that's in your own eye? What Jesus is saying is this: check yourself first. It's really easy to see other people's mistakes, problems, and shortcomings. But Jesus said, you need to check yourself, right? Check yourself first. In Isaiah chapter 58, now this entire chapter is teaching on how to fast, how not to fast, and then how to fast. And by the way, fasting is a New Testament discipline, right? And it's abstaining from food and just drinking water for a period of time. And by the way, this chapter makes it very clear that a normal fast is just one day. One day. It's a 24-hour period, just drink water. It says, isn't this the fast I've chosen? Right? And he's just been talking about, you do these things, he said, that are wrong, the wrong way to fast. But now he says, this is what I've chosen. Now he begins to talk about the rewards of fasting. It says, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke. And then he turns to the inside and he said, isn't it to share your bread with the hungry? Have compassion on the poor and the destitute. Isn't it to bring the poor who are cast out into your house, right? And when you see the naked, to cover him. And now this is the one I wanted to get to. And to not hide yourself from your own flesh. To not hide yourself from your own flesh. Now, this is what this is saying. When it's talking about your own flesh, it's talking about your relatives, right? How many have ever gone to a family reunion and there was somebody there that you saw them and you just kind of like went the other way? Right? You're just like, I just can't handle them, you know? And literally what this is saying, it's saying when you're drawing close to God, you need to have compassion on the poor, and you need to make sure that you don't have issues with people in your family, that you've got no unforgiveness, that you've got no resentment. He says, you don't hide from those people. Go to those people and make it right, all right? Move away from unforgiveness, move away from bitterness, move away from strife. So in Genesis chapter 13, we find Abraham and Lot. And here's what it says, all right? And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And the Canaanites and the Perizzites dwelt in the land. So Abraham said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me, between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we're brethren. Isn't the whole land before you? Please separate from me. And if you take the left, I'll go to the right. And if you go to the right, I'll go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the plain of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, or the Garden of Eden, like the land of Egypt as you go towards Sor. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan. And Lot journeyed eastward. And obviously, Abraham goes to the west. And to the west, it's desert. All right? Now listen to verse 14. And the Lord said to Abram, after he had separated from Lot, right? Lift up your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. And all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants like the dust of the earth. As if a man could number the dust of the earth, so then your descendants could also be numbered. So that number one, the greater person is always the first one to move away from strife and contention. Abraham was the greater person. He said, let's not have strife. Let's move away from it, right? And he was willing to sacrifice financially to move away from strife. Lot chose that beautiful, beautiful valley, lush and green. And Abraham turned and went into a wilderness. But you know who got blessed? Abraham got blessed. God blessed him and increased him. And after he had separated, after he moved away from strife, God said to him, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to bless your descendants. When you move away from strife, there's blessing. And there may be, in some of us here today, that you've got some strife in your family, in your business, and you need to move away from strife, right? And when you do, God will bless you as a result of your moving away from that strife, right? This is so important, an issue with God. I want you to listen to Matthew chapter 5. Again, this is the Sermon on the Mount, the greatest sermon that was ever preached. Verse 23. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. So, typically the way that we think is this. That Christianity is about do, all right? Now, let me just tell you, Christianity is not about do. Christianity is about done. Jesus said, it is finished, right? It's not about something that you earn, right? Because Christianity is not about you did something to earn your salvation. It's because Jesus has done something and paid for your salvation, right? But we tend to look at outward actions that people have. But what God looks at is the heart. Here's somebody who's bringing an offering, who's making a sacrifice. And God says, first check your heart. He said, if you're there and you realize your brother has something against you, this isn't you have something against him. He has something against you. He said, go and be reconciled. Go move away from strife. Don't let there be bitterness and unforgiveness in your heart. The Christian gospel is the gospel of receiving forgiveness and giving forgiveness. It's moving away from strife and resentment and unforgiveness, right? Those are just key things in the Christian gospel. Let me just tell you one story as we close, all right? On the 13th of May, 1981, a Turkish national by the name of Ali Agca traveled to Italy, and he made his way to Rome. And he had come to assassinate John Paul II. And as the Pope, John Paul II, went through St. Peter's Square, Ali Agca made his way as close as he possibly could and opened fire on John Paul II at point blank range. He shot him 4 times. He was critically wounded. He was taken to the hospital. He was in surgery for 6 hours. Spent 22 days in the hospital. Ali Agca is apprehended at the scene. He's tried and convicted in an Italian court, and his sentence was life in prison. But when John Paul recovered in 1983, he went to visit an Italian prison. And he went to see his would-be assassin, Ali Agca, the assassin that had tried to take his life and had shot him 4 times. He sat down with Ali Agca, and he held his hand, and he said, I forgive you. And he literally said, we became friends. He left saying, I have made a new friend. And it's interesting, years later, as John Paul was sick, he would get well cards from Ali Agca, right? It captivated the minds of the media. It literally made the cover of Time magazine. I think we've even got the picture of the Pope sitting in that prison with Ali Aja, where he pardons the gunman. Somebody actually even wrote a song about it, Stephen Taylor. He said, I saw a man, he was holding the hand that had fired a gun at his heart. Oh, will we live to forgive? And that's true. He sat there and he held his hand and he gave forgiveness. And I really think we should look into our hearts and say, who is the Ali Aja in my life? The person that fired a gun at my heart, who accused you falsely, who abused you, who stole your inheritance, who wronged the ones that you love, who denied you, who you were a victim of their prejudice, again, who treated you unfairly, who brought injustice into your life. If there is somebody that was like an Ali Aja to you, and they did something to you that really, when you think about it, it hurts you to this day. Just like the Pope forgave, you should forgive. You should forgive. So I'm going to ask everybody to bow your heads a moment. Right? And I'm going to just walk you through some steps of forgiveness. There's really 4 steps to forgiveness. The first step is this: going to God and say, God, I have held unforgiveness against somebody, and I ask you to forgive me for holding unforgiveness in my heart. And if you've held unforgiveness against somebody that has shot you in your life, in your heart, ask God to forgive you. But then the second step is to forgive them as a decision. Simply say, God, I forgive that person, and I release them, and I demand and I ask for no recompense for the wrong that they've done to me. That's a decision. And the third step is to pray for them. Those that have mistreated you, those that have persecuted you, those that have maligned you. Jesus said, you pray for that person. Pray God's blessing on that person. That God would reveal himself to them. That God would open their spiritual eyes. And the blessings that you would want in your life. To pray those blessings on that person.